Welcome back to Conversations with B'nai B'rith. I'm Dan Mariaschin, B'nai B'rith CEO. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're talking about Yiddish New York, specifically a new exhibit at the Jewish Theological Seminary that spotlights how the city became a vital part of Yiddish life and culture in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. First, if you enjoy this series, make sure you subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook to watch all of our latest interviews. And of course, visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. Though New York's Yiddish theater district, known as the Yiddish or Jewish Rialto, has largely gone dark, the city remains a Yiddish cultural hub and destination. An exhibit open to the public at the Jewish Theological Seminary, or JTS, called Living Yiddish in New York, introduces visitors to rare archival materials that provide a snapshot of New York City as the preeminent epicenter of modern Yiddish culture. Well, how did Yiddish-speaking Jews respond to the challenges of their new home in America, while also ensuring the continuity of Yiddish art, music, and literature? Dr. David Kraemer, co-curator of JTS's special exhibit, joins me now to answer this and to, as exhibit co-curator Annabel Cohen puts it, paint a vivid picture of Yiddish New York in all its nuances and contradictions. Dr. Kraemer, professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, has been a part of the JTS community since 1977, when he enrolled at the graduate school, receiving his PhD in 1984. More recently, since accepting the position of librarian in 2004, he's played a crucial role in expanding the impact of the library's world-renowned collections and programs, making exhibits like Living Yiddish in New York possible. Dr. Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator as well. His books include A History of the Talmud, published in 2019, and Jewish Eating and Identity Through the Ages, published in 2007. He has written influential articles on the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Mishnah, and more. Dr. Kraemer, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk about you for a moment. As a professor, your focus is on the literary analysis of rabbinic literature, rabbinic ritual, and social and religious history of Jews in late antiquity, among other areas of expertise. How did the concept for the JTS Archives exhibition evolve, and how does being the JTS librarian, in addition to being a professor, help inform what Living Yiddish in New York should be focused on? And an additional question, just to get us started, what years does the show span specifically, and how did you decide that?
Wow, those are a lot of questions, actually. So let me cover as I remember what you just said, and please feel free to refocus if it is appropriate. So this exhibit is part of my responsibility as director of the JTS library. This library, as you just said, is one of the most extraordinary collections of Judaica, and particularly rare Judaica, on earth. And in our new library, this is crucial. We built in recent years and just opened in its fullest sense the new library about a year ago, actually. We were open before that during the pandemic, but our rare materials returned from their storage only about a year ago. We have been running in our new Dorothy Goldman exhibition galleries a program of exhibits that will continue, we hope, forever into the future. And this is one of our ways of emphasizing that the legacy we hold, these extraordinary rare materials, are not just for scholars, but they're for all levels of the public, interested students, general public, Jews and non-Jews. We feel that we have a responsibility to use these materials to help educate the world about the riches of Jewish culture and ideas in their full variety and richness. And it is under that rubric that this exhibition can best be understood. One of the benefits of having this collection and doing these exhibitions at JTS is that we've got extraordinary academic resources. So As you said, I personally specialize in rabbinic Judaism of late antiquity. My research has brought my attentions to modernity, and I have to say that research has been enriched by the library and by our rare materials of variety of sorts. In this particular case, I do not claim to be an expert. I have been a co-curator on this, but our guest curator, a graduate student here who works with Professor David Fishman in modern Jewish history, she is concentrating in the field of Yiddish. She's the true expert behind this, and I and my colleague Naomi Steinberger worked with her to create this exhibition. It's really an extraordinary exhibition, and we hope that many, many people will continue to come because it's been very much in demand. We have a larger collection of Yiddish materials than we knew. Big libraries have a lot of materials that they don't fully grasp. And while we began a project over 20 years ago to try to get a sense of the range of our Yiddish materials, we really didn't come to grasp its fullness until we began to explore what we've got here. Marvelously, there is a return to Yiddish and Yiddish culture amongst young Jews in New York and elsewhere in recent times. And there was a conference at Columbia in December where we were asked to present on our Yiddish materials. So we brought it all together using the new technologies, and lo and behold, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of things, many of them quite rare and even unique. And I can't begin to describe to you the excitement of these young people who are beginning the exploration. So that's the broad background and the way it connects to my work. The exhibit itself originates with a generous gift by a couple, Nathan Feingold and Pearl Halegua, who gave us an endowment to expand and consolidate our Yiddish collections. And part of that gift was to create an exhibit. And Pearl sat down with us and emphasized that she wanted us to show Yiddish in its living glory. Not as a dead past, but as something that still reverberates in recent years and even until today. Given the nature of our materials, most of what we cover is from the first third of the 20th century. Our gallery is small. We could have gone beyond that. We actually made some painful cuts in the end when we decided the range of the exhibition. Maybe we'll do that again in the future, but at this point we have some late 19th century materials, very, very rich in the first third of the 20th century before the Great War and then the interwar period. We have then little pieces from post-war to show the way the roots and the cultures and the exciting expansiveness, creativity of Jews in New York during that period continued in decades to follow.
So most of us, when we think about Yiddish in America, of course, spoken all over America, my parents were Yiddish speakers, but they were living in New Hampshire. But when we think of Yiddish in New York and really the broader picture of Yiddish culture, we think of the Lower East Side. Tell us about the earliest materials, Yiddish materials that were available in New York, and did that come out of the Lower East Side? So when did all of this begin to happen? When were newspapers beginning to be published? When were books being published? When did it all really begin in earnest?
Well, I mean, the large migration, of course, began in the late 19th century and gathered steam so that by the time we get to immediately before the Great War, I think we could, from their perspective, call it that, immediately before World War I, there were something like 1.4 million Jews in New York City, an extraordinary number. Not all of them immigrants. Of course, there had been earlier immigrations, but far smaller than this added population. And they were coming from areas in the Russian Empire, Ukraine, Lithuania, Poland, and so forth. They were overwhelmingly Yiddish speakers, and they continued that culture here. New York provided them with both a challenge and a welcome home. The welcoming part of this home was the fact that, unlike in the old country, they did not face the same kinds of persecutions. They had come, they didn't need to flee. They also were free to pursue their souls and their politics in ways that were quickly closing down in the old world. So part of what this meant, for example, if we're talking about theater, if we're talking about publication, those things in the Russian Empire required approval. You could not just put on any old play, or you couldn't just publish anything you desired. It needed to pass a regime of effectively censorship. In this country, there was no such regime in place. And what it meant was that as political views developed, and the political views were a combination of both the education, I think I would use that word, the currents, the political currents of the old world. And we shouldn't forget that the Jews who came here, many of them were already well aware of and even involved in the leftist movements that in the Russian Empire led to the communist revolution and the like. In this country, having hoped for a golden land, a golden Medina, they found that the beginnings were far more difficult than they had imagined. So labor movements, both socialist and communist and even anarchist, all of this developed. Being able to publish those things here, there was a very abundant, diverse Yiddish press. Being able to publish here, we've even got on display one very, very touching piece that was printed here in New York. It comes from Die Freiheit, so communist, anarchist background, was sent to Europe as part of the promotion of the party line, and these ideas could not be fully expressed in Europe, went to Europe, survived the Second World War, and came back as part of the recovery of Jewish articles, publications, and so forth. JTS was one of many institutions, the JTS library, that was able to take in materials after the war that no longer had owners. And this particular page actually, in effect, comes back home to New York. It originated here. It was sent back to Europe as part of the promotion of its political ideas. And it is now again in a New York collection and available to be seen in this exhibition.
I want to follow up, if I can, a little bit on the politics, because it is interesting how political thinking just flowered among Yiddish speakers. And today, people who know a bit about Yiddish and Jewish culture identify the speaking of Yiddish with the factory. Many of these folks were workers, with the Forward and the other newspapers. There were a number of others. I think East Broadway was called the Fleet Street of the Lower East Side. And with pamphlets that were published, as you say, at the height of the labor movement. So which do you think came first, the language or the sentiment? In other words, did those who spoke Yiddish at the forefront of socialism arrive as already as believers in socialist ideology, or did they acquire their activism because they were here in the United States? Different kind of atmosphere, as you've said, open. You can publish, you can speak, you can go out on the corner. I'm sure there was an equivalent of Hyde Park. So what do you think? Which came first?
Of course, when we hear the phrase "which came first," we're tempted to say the chicken or the egg. And of course, the beauty of that phrase is that it's impossible to determine. These matters are always multi-determined. So, if I were being a little bit smart alecky about it, I would begin by saying, well, this is just the way humans learn and create in a cycle that reinforces and goes in directions that one could never have predicted from the beginning. But Jews were notably prominent in these movements, very significantly, far beyond their numbers. Of course, there were workers, many, 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 many workers in New York and beyond who were not Yiddish-speaking Jews, but Jews were extremely prominent in this. And so we have to be a little bit more nuanced about the way we respond to a question like the one that you just asked. There is no doubt that something about the experience in the old country led for Jews to be activists in these developing movements, to be really instrumental in the creation of new unions, workers, cooperatives, and so forth, to speak out politically in ways that were very, very bold. And they genuinely became leaders. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, for example, Jews were instrumental in the creation, other such organizations as well. So what was it about the immigrant Jewish experience that led to this? Part of it, as I said already, was the fact that they were more exposed to the ideas of socialism and communism than many who resided on these shores, that is in the US, New York and beyond, at this point in history. And so they already had a tradition. It was a newish tradition, but it was already a tradition that at least some of them had inclinations toward at the beginning. I would like to think that, frankly, Judaism in general is an activist culture. And there are, I mean, we see it still to this day. There are many teachings that come from the Jewish past that have easily been secularized. And many, of course, of the immigrants, if they weren't already secular when they arrived, they quickly saw becoming American as becoming secular. And there are a variety of pieces in this exhibition that show that in subtle and even amusing ways. If you're interested, I can illustrate that. But they, these secular Jewish values, not by might and not by power, but by the Spirit, right? The commitment to justice. All of these were part of the prophetic tradition, which translated easily into an activist social justice concern. And that was part of the experience of these Jews as well. The other thing we've got to look at, of course, is the precise time in the development of mechanization, factory work, the kinds of laws that were or were not yet in place to protect workers, the beginning of a revolt against taking advantage of workers that was genuinely oppressive, the number of hours, the kind of work that was required, the difficulty of the pay, all of this we know very, very well. I mean, there are various parts of the exhibition, actually, that touch on the nuances of this.
Well, along with politics, Yiddish certainly had its tremendous impact on the New York art scene. In terms of literature, where could readers encounter fiction and nonfiction written in Yiddish by New York writers? And what documents and artifacts are on view at JTS to illustrate this?
That's a great question, and something that we love. We've got some exceptional journals that are in our collection that we have as part of the exhibit here. The way the exhibition is divided, we devote a little bit of time to what I would describe as popular Yiddish culture, kind of popular theater, song, and the like. And of course, most cultures are more about popular culture than anything else. And certainly Yiddish performance and song were abundant in that register. But there's also a register of higher culture, or what we commonly call higher culture, that included literature in the full and proper sense of the term. One of the journals we show is a beautiful opening page, and we could have chosen many more, from a journal called Das Neue Land. That was really, a higher taste literary journal. We also find that there are satirical journals that tinged with the politics that we were, just speaking of, which take a very, very critical view, not only on the experience of Yiddish-speaking immigrants in New York, in America, but comment in critical ways on the complications of the adaptations of the immigrant community. And so to contrast two pieces of the exhibit, we set up two pairings of postcards that were printed at the time. And these are before and after postcards, really quite striking and visually arresting. One of those pairings, in our exhibit, the top one says that in the old country, and there's an image, a very nice image, in the old country, he was a Rav, and it's got a picture of a gentleman sitting at a table with Sfarim, with sacred books open in front of him, clearly studying. And in the New World, he's got to make a living, so he can't afford to do that kind of rabbinic work to engage in study. So in the New World, he's a peddler. Right below it, there is another pairing which says, in the old world, he was a peddler, and in the new world, he paskins shilas. He answers rabbinic questions addressed to rabbis. And that's true too, because the level of expertise for religious questions amongst a large part of this population was quite low. And so you didn't need to know a lot to be the expert. The same movement from peddler, well, let me start with the first one, from rabbi to peddler and from peddler to Rav. These sound like opposite narratives, but they're actually quite a bit the same. They're all part of the story in a very different register. When we talk about the satirical journals, there is a cover that we show from the Große Kinder, the big prankster, it's called, or the big stick actually is the way they translate it in English, which shows the values of the enlightened world: liberty, equality, fraternity, going back to the French Revolution, right? And liberty shows one of the leaders of the socialist movement in jail. Equality shows a Rockefeller sitting in front of a judge, right? And of course, Rockefeller's not going to have the same kind of justice as somebody else. And then fraternity shows the presidential candidates of the time, Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, engaged in hand-to-hand combat with daggers drawn, about to stab one another. So the ideas are very, very sophisticated, and their execution is just right in your gut. It's a beautiful combination.
Well, we've talked about politics and talked a little about literature, the journals that you've just mentioned. Now we arrive at a place on our New York City itinerary that's most associated with the Yiddish language, I think, Second Avenue. For its theaters. I know I recall my father saying he lived in Brooklyn, but they would go to Second Avenue to the theaters to see Maurice Schwartz and some of the great names in the Yiddish theatrical world. In reality, though, it was not just Second Avenue, but the uptown world of the Broadway stage as well, where shows might have been performed in English. Even so, Yiddish still maintained a very strong presence or a strong influence, whether it was on Broadway or whether it was on the Lower East Side. Talk to us a little bit about sort of the doubleness of Yiddish theater and what kinds of materials from this world are included in the Living Yiddish in New York exhibition. And can visitors see play scripts and other similar artifacts to kind of get a sense and get a feel of what it was all about?
We do not have play scripts out. One of the challenges with putting on any exhibition is finding things that are engaging and help to relay the narrative while at the same time being visually interesting or arresting. So putting out something that's just text doesn't work for this kind of exhibition. Having said that, we do have some wonderful images of stage performances, Yiddish theater, in this case from the 1930s. Wise Men of Chelm is the play that we have images of here. When I'm leading people through the exhibit, I like to draw attention to a wall at the wonderful Immigration Museum at Ellis Island, where one can go in and there is a full wall that contains the covers of sheet music, of playbills, of the like, inviting audiences to come see these performances in virtually any of the languages of the immigrants. There's Italian, there's Yiddish, there's Chinese. I mean, it's just remarkable. Jews participated in a very broad phenomenon. The difference is that Jews did it with particular concentration and intensity. The Yiddish Rialto, which you've mentioned, in any given night might have had as many as 30 performances. And we've got various pieces illustrating this. Again, the posters that advertise the plays with the individual stars who were appearing in them. We wish we could have shown more, but it certainly gives people a taste. What I would add to this is that thanks to the funders, we're also doing some programming in connection to this, and we're very, very pleased, and I think people will know this, that there is new Yiddish theater in New York. One would not have expected this. There is both something as well known as Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish, which began downtown and then moved to Broadway. It's going to be produced again. But there's also new Yiddish writing that will appear in various small settings, and who knows where that might lead. Some of I mean, the new Yiddish writing, the drama, reflects the concerns of the young people who are themselves reimmersing in Yiddish today. So you've got, not unexpectedly, questions of gender and questions of the justice of the communities and their leaders and so forth. This is part of a new Yiddish culture that I have no doubt will continue to find an audience.
I think that's really what impresses me the most about the Yiddish language. Its tremendous resilience. That every time it's been written off, it just comes back. Not of course coming back, and it won't come back to the point where there were 400,000 Jews living in the Lower East Side, and every window that was open in every tenement building, you could hear Yiddish, the newspapers and everything else that you've talked about. But as an important language of the Jewish people, it continues to find new variants, and I think that's it says a lot about its resilience. I want to go back, if I can, a little bit to an area connected to the Yiddish Rialto, and that would be the composers and the lyricists of Tin Pan Alley. What can visitors see and perhaps hear about Jewish musical masters that reveal not only the pervasiveness of Yiddish words, but also the origins of many tunes that are rooted in the language itself?
Yeah, I mean, what they can see is sheet music. That's what we've got in the exhibit itself. Unfortunately, we do not have the means or capacity to provide access to recordings of these things, although many of them are available now online. I have to emphasize that the focus of the exhibition is necessitated by the size of the galleries. And so what one comes away with is, I think, the unmistakable sense that this was a culture that was alive and vibrant and has not disappeared despite its waning. It's interesting, as you talk about Yiddish coming back. Of course, one of the reasons that Yiddish has flourished is because of its use in ultra-Orthodox communities, in Hasidic communities. I think, this is my interpretation, I'm sure I could find those to support me in this. When one looks at younger families, and I know of families where the parents have relearned Yiddish and they are raising their children in Yiddish, not in the religious community, though they themselves may be observant in one way or the other, but in order to recover, to reinforce the possibility of living in the world speaking Yiddish, not to live only in communities that seek to separate themselves to one degree or another, but to live in the world. And that's what comes through more than anything else in this exhibition. It's called Living Yiddish in New York for a reason. It's about Yiddish-speaking Jews being part of the broader society and the broader culture and engaging in the broad literary and political and artistic movements that other cultures were engaging as well. We were adapting them, we were becoming American. And one of the ironies, and we show this too, because we think it's an important part of the dynamic, is that as all of these efforts succeeded, and they succeeded very, very well, amongst the earliest materials we have are Yiddish English phrase books, right? With one column in Yiddish, another column with Hebrew letters with the English translation, and then English, right? So that the immigrants would learn what they needed. There are handbooks for when you go to take the citizenship exam. These are the kinds of questions you can expect, and these are the answers that you can give. We've got a Yiddish translation of the Constitution. So that's part of making a home. The other part, though, is becoming fully modern. So Workman's Circle Press, we've got 2 of 4 books of this sort come from their press. We've got a book on modern hygiene, how to live according to modern sensibilities with respect to health, how to eat a proper diet. We've got a vegetarian cookbook in Yiddish, suggesting that this is the most healthful way to live, to eat, which I love myself being a vegetarian. How to raise children in the modern fashion. And we've got it open to a beautiful image of an infant in a swaddling cloth with, demonstration of how to use this modern swaddling cloth. All of this was in the world. You could have found all of these things in the other languages. As I began to say, the irony of it is that it succeeded so well that the next stage of production was in the camps, right? In the Yiddish-speaking camps upstate. They began to educate their children in Yiddish because Yiddish was being lost in the next generation. The children were speaking English. But we're thrilled, as you said before, to celebrate the fact that it has not been lost. And we're seeing a revival now. We hope we contribute in a very small way to that revival.
Just to follow up, the big picture, and I think you've stated it, but I'll ask it perhaps, and maybe you can answer it a little bit more broadly. The exhibit that you've curated, how does that change the narrative around Yiddish New York and the impact of Yiddish theater, language, music, culture, etc., on the history of New York and possibly the history of America?
Wow, what a wonderful question. So how do we understand the impact of this culture? I mean, it's really a fabulous question. I think that one of the things that one cannot miss, we got this actually a copy. We use it as a wall graphic from the collection. They have a very good collection of Yiddish materials. And in this case, it's from their Judaica collection at NYPL, the New York Public Library, of Jewish New York in 1904, 05, I think is the year, with over 100 significant Jewish sites being listed on the map. And that doesn't even begin to account for it all. So, I mean, the Jewish Theological Seminary is already considered to be a significant site. There, you've got Lower East Side synagogues and Yiddish publishers, and organizations, Jewish hospitals, all of the ways that Jews began to build in this country are already listed in that map. And of course, much more would come after that year. For those who are New Yorkers, what's fascinating about the map is that it's got a list of the very first subways, which had just been dedicated, the number 1, 2, and 3 line. All the rest of the lines are still elevated trains when this map was made, which is, again, just so amusing. What was the impact? We can't miss the fact that New York was and certainly continued to be, in very significant respects, the cultural engine of the United States. Certainly not the only place of origin, but the most significant. I think all would agree. Even when filmmaking moved out west, New York continued to play that position. And it is quite true that whether we talk about stage or publishing or songwriting for musicals or for film, and we can go on and on, Jews were not unique in contributing to those things, but Jews who felt so much at home politically, culturally, as full citizens of what New York represented, made themselves prominent in all of those fields. And if New York influenced the rest of the country in publishing, in theater, in music, and the like, then we can't miss the place of Jews in that. And those Jews, at the beginnings at least, were overwhelmingly Yiddish-speaking Jews. If you're dreaming of a white Christmas, as we all know, that's going to go back to a Jewish composer. And there's a lot more to say on that, but that's, I think, beyond the scope of what you're asking.
So one final question, which just occurred to me, and you mentioned the space issue. Is there a documentary in the works? Because it would seem that this project would lend itself well to the documentary genre.
Excellent question. I wish there were. If you can help us find a donor, we'd be happy to do it. What I will say is that, and our curator, Annabel Cohen, has developed a video version of the exhibit, and we have it available to us, and she will be making online presentations. So it's not an actual documentary, it's not video, but it's a beautiful slideshow that includes many of the materials that I have made mention of, and we hope that it will be shared with many people, not only during the life of the exhibit, but beyond it as well. The exhibit has already been extended because of the demand for seeing it, in the flesh on site. So rather than closing in August, it will go till the end of September, and all of our guided tours are oversubscribed. That too, I think, is excellent news for anybody who's interested in Yiddish culture. You mentioned you're growing up with Yiddish. I would only add that I grew up without Yiddish because my Yiddish-speaking grandparents, in the proverbial way, used it as their secret language with my parents. So, any Yiddish I know, and it is very little, I've had to pick up myself in engagements like the preparation for this exhibit.
Yeah, but I'll tell you one thing. It was also used as a language that they didn't want the children to hear. But I always thought that because that was the case, you strained to figure out what it is they were talking about. So in a way, through osmosis, you picked up the Yiddish. Well, Living Yiddish in New York, curated by Dr. David Kraemer and his JTS colleagues, is open to the public now until the end of September 2023. Head to jtsa.edu/news to learn more about the special exhibition and to help plan your visit to the JTS library. Well, I cannot imagine the amount of time you and your co-curator spent crafting this exhibit, what to include, what not to include. This exhibit is truly a gift to those who want to understand more about Yiddish New York and really Jewish American culture. Thank you, Dr. Kraemer, for being with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been my pleasure.
Well, thank you again to Dr. David Kraemer and to you, for watching this conversation with B'nai B'rith. Now, if you enjoyed the interview, subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. And be sure to visit bnaibrith.org to learn more about our work. For my guest, Dr. David Kraemer, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you next time. Take care, everyone.